Good morning, everyone. We're glad that once again you're able to listen to us. We'll be studying from 2 John, verses 4 through 6 in just a few minutes. My name is Charles Wright. I'm the evangelist of the Spearsville Road Church of Christ in Trafalgar, Indiana. If you're in the area and you're able to worship with us, we'll be more than happy to have you come and be with us. We're meeting now at Sunday at 10 o'clock and then also Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Each of those are for an hour. And again, we're spacing from each other and wearing masks when necessary. And so we again invite you to come and worship with us in a safe environment so that again we can glorify God together. In this particular greeting to the elect lady and her children, as we saw last week from 2 John, we notice that John wrote there in verse 3 that the grace, the mercy, and the love which proceeds from the Father and the Son is in the sphere of truth and love. So now in verses 4 through 6, he expands upon this theme of truth and love, and he does so in the form of a commendation. He commends this lady and her children for walking in the truth. But then he exhorts them to simply love one another. And so in the study this morning for the next few minutes, we want to look at this commendation as well as this exhortation and try to learn as much as we can as far as the principles or the lessons that we can learn from this particular passage. So look with me at 2 John verses 4 through 6, where he says, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one that we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you've heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. Notice this commendation in verse 4. The commendation for walking in the truth. He says, I rejoiced greatly. Either by visiting or having received a report from others, John has come to know that some of the elect lady's children were walking in the truth. And this was a source of great joy to John, just as it was, as we'll see in 3 John in verse 3, where he talks there about Gaius as well. And how in verse 4 of 3 John he expressed the fact that there was no greater joy than hearing about others who were walking in the truth. But what about this? What about the joy of hearing someone obeying the gospel? We recognize that during this virus and during these events that are happening now in the time in which we live, that a number of people are thinking of death. They're thinking of the possibility of death, and so they're drawing closer to their Lord, to their God, and as a result of such, they are obeying the gospel. But again, we have to recognize that just as great as that might be, there's always that possibility that one will simply not carry through with their initial obedience to the gospel. And that realization can temper one's joy. But when time reveals that the person continues to walk in the truth, that removes the question of simply whether one will carry through with their obedience to Christ. And so thus John tells us here that it's a great source of joy. A great source of joy in the Christian faith when it can be, again, in the follow-up of new converts, as well as also noticing the evangelizing of those who are lost. But yet now we turn to that phrase where he says, I have found some of your children. Unfortunately, John could not say all of her children, but he could say some of her children. And this reminds us that even the best of parents can have children who simply err from the faith. Despite the fact that this mother was so special that she is referred to as an elect lady, she is no different than like Samuel in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. He was a prophet of God who had some children who were not faithful to the Lord. Well, now, whose fault is this? There's a passage in Proverbs 22 and in verse 6, which tells us to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And there are people who read that passage and say to us that if your child falls from the grace of God, that it's always the parent's fault and only the parent's fault. But in reality, if this is true, this view would suggest a belief, you could say, in environmental predestination. And that is simply that if the parent provides the proper environment in the raising of their child, there is no choice for the child but to simply turn out a certain way. And this would really strip the child of any personal responsibility. and lay blame solely upon the parents. Now, again, we recognize that the parent will indeed bear some responsibility if no effort is made to restrain the child in their sin. Again, like in 1 Samuel 3, verses 11 through 13. But the Bible talks about the ultimate responsibility of the soul that sins. That's the one who will die. And so again, in Ezekiel 18 and verse 20, we find that particular passage. And so we understand that parents are to simply train up their children in the way they should go, that fathers are not to provoke them, that they're to raise them up in the nurturing and the admonition of the Lord, as Ephesians tells us. And indeed, it's their responsibility, and they do not, they will have to answer to God because of such. But ultimately, it's the child. It's the child who simply makes the decision to follow the Lord, to remain faithful to the Lord if he becomes a child of God. But there's another view also that we need to think about for just a minute here in Proverbs 22 and in verse 6. The literal rendering of that particular passage is to train up a child according to his own way. That means according to his own temperament, according to his own aptitude. That is, if he is mechanically inclined and able to do things with his hands and the working on cars, or maybe possibly capable of being something with woodworking and construction along those lines, then you should not probably train him to be a doctor or a lawyer or things such as that. And so again, this view recognizes that this view, simply like, or this verse I should say, like much of Proverbs, is giving simply practical advice. It's giving us practical advice on the raising of children, and to realize that children are different. Each child is different and should be raised according to their own particular disposition and skills. Failure to recognize this results in a child being forced to simply become something that he or she is not, and will not likely, therefore, remain in it. And so the fact remains that in spite of the best parenting possible, some children simply choose to rebel against God. But then he tells us to walk in the truth as we have received the commandment from the Father. And this again expresses this idea of living in harmony with the truth. And of course we understand that the truth is found in God's Word. And so everything that one does demonstrates a life that is governed by God's commandments. And again, is this something that is legalism? Is this something like telling us that we can earn our salvation or that we can merit our salvation? No, it simply means that if you truly love God, you'll do what he says. In 1 John 5:3 and in John 14:15 and in John 15:14, we find there passages that tell us that indeed if we say that we love God and do not keep his commandments, that we're liars and the truth is not in us, that indeed we must keep his commandments if we say that we love God. And so with great joy in his heart, John commends here this elect lady and her children for their walking in the truth. But an emphasis on walking in the truth without an equal emphasis on loving one another can easily develop a harsh, impatient, and insensitive disposition towards others. Just as simply knowledge without love produces arrogance, as Paul warned the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 8 and in verse 1. So therefore it should not surprise us to find John following his commendation for walking in the truth with an exhortation in verses 5 and 6, an exhortation here to love one another. And he begins this exhortation by saying, "And now I plead with you, lady." You know, the tone here of John's entreaty suggests the seriousness of this exhortation. John has certainly stressed in his first epistle the importance of this command to love one another. Multiple places in 1 John 2:10 and in 1 John 3:14 and in 1 John 4 verses 20 and 21. And so John clearly is letting us know that this is a commandment that's not to be taken lightly, that we are to love one another. And he says it's not as though I wrote a new commandment. This commandment, he says, is not a new one. It did not originate from John. It is one which his readers had known since the beginning of their experience of becoming a Christian. It is the commandment that it was given by Jesus himself in the Gospel of John as well. And so indeed, how important it is that we love one another. And so this commandment given by Jesus, as he says here, is to love another, especially again according to that standard of love that Jesus has shown to us. And John 13:34, he tells us to love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And then John says, this is a love that walks according to his commandments. And again, here we learn what best demonstrates that we truly love one another. When I am keeping the commandments of God, I demonstrate my true love for the brethren, as 1 John 5 and verse 2 told us. You know, you can claim brotherly love simply all day long, but unless you're walking according to God's commandments, your claim simply is meaningless. Unless you're actually doing something for your brother in an active way, you cannot claim really that you love them. Because again, this love is an active goodwill. It's a seeking of the best for others, no matter how those others treat you. And so he tells us here that this is the commandment that you should walk in it. This sentence, again, is just simply reinforcing what John has been saying. The command to love is one that we have heard and have had from the beginning. We should therefore keep this commandment by walking in love. This repetition is often necessary, for there's always a tendency to simply hear things and not simply obey things. The 3 R's of learning that we have to recognize is repetition, repetition, repetition. And that is the best way. That's the way in which we recognize that we'll learn the most from our studying of God's Word. With joy in his heart, John here simply commends. With a pleading voice, he exhorts. He commends them for walking in the truth, and he exhorts them to walk in love. You know, there's a tendency, always a tendency, to simply do one another, really without the other. Some people hold to the truth, but they do so without love, and that breeds harshness. Others are quick to say that they display love, but they neglect the truth, and that produces compromise. And so both are wrong, and there's only one alternative, to simply walk in the truth and to walk in love. And so I hope that God will help us always to do both of these faithfully. And I hope that indeed you've learned that importance from this particular passage this morning. We ask you, if you would, please, to continue listening to these lessons. So Wednesday we'll be studying again 2 Peter, and we'll continue here in 2 John next Sunday morning. If you, again, are in the area of Trafalgar, we invite you to come and to worship with us. We'll be more than happy to have you. Our prayers are that all is well with you and with your family. And again, we hope that you continue to look to God during these difficult times.